Good. So in the Yoga Sutra of Patanjali, one phrase in particular has continued to vex scholars and interpreters, Dharmamegha Samadhi. This technical term occurs in the fourth pada, or chapter of the text, and refers to a meditational attainment in the course of the yogi's path. A term that in some sense seems to evoke Neo's experience of true reality at the end of the Matrix. Or pause. You've all seen the Matrix? Okay. How do I exit it?
I got you. You got it.
Yeah. So for a recap, this is Dharmamegha Samadhi live for you. So Neo has this moment where he sees the true nature of reality, which is encoded like Dharma, right? Holding characteristics which hold reality. Live Dharmamegha Samadhi. All right. So now be not in doubt. That's what it's really like. And so in interpreting the meaning of this state, then, scholars have often acknowledged that the term rarely, if ever, occurs in a Hindu context, but frequently occurs in the literature of Mahayana Buddhism. It is well established that Buddhism was a significant influence on the Yoga Sutra as a whole. In his historical overview and translation of the text, Christopher Key Chappell wrote that, quote, "The Buddhist tradition is closely linked with yoga. Both Buddhism and yoga place emphasis on the centrality of human suffering and gradual processes of purification required to attain the shared goal of nirodha, or the cessation of the causes that lead to suffering," end quote. And he goes on to list various Buddhist practices which are utilized in the text. More recently, in the introduction to their translated and edited source book on yoga, James Mallinson and Mark Singleton wrote that, quote, "The influence of Buddhism is also evident in the text, and the Patanjali Yoga Shastra represents a Brahminical attempt to appropriate yoga from the Shramana traditions," end quote. In the ensuing chapters, they also point to Buddhist source materials which bear relation to the text. However, with the notable exception of Chappell's book and Klaus Klostermeyer's 1986 article, Dharmamegha Samadhi, Comments on Yoga Sutra 429, Patanjali's usage of Dharmamegha Samadhi in the context of Mahayana Buddhist marga or path literature has not received adequate attention. In this essay, I will examine Patanjali's uses of Dharmamegha Samadhi through the lens of Mahayana Bodhisattva-marga literature. Specifically, I argue that outside of the context of this literature, Dharmamegha Samadhi remains obscure, and attempts to interpret it remain strained. More broadly, this study highlights the interactions between Buddhist and yogic path literature in the early centuries of the Common Era. So before examining this term in Mahayana Buddhist sources, it would be prudent to briefly outline the history of the Yoga Sutra, examine the usage of the term in the text, and consider contemporary interpretations of the verses in question. The Yoga Sutra, the seminal text of the classical yoga traditions, outlines yogic thought and practice in 196 terse aphorisms. As such, it functions as a contribution to literature focused on introducing and explaining the past stages of an aspirant of spiritual religious practices that were in vogue in the classical Gupta era of India. The phrase Dharmamegha Samadhi occurs in verse 29 of the Kaivalya Pada, or fourth chapter of the Yoga Sutra, as a penultimate stage of trance that the yogi reaches prior to liberation. While the word samadhi is used throughout the text to refer to various states of concentrated absorption, and dharma is used 5 times in its semantic meaning as a characteristic, the phrase Dharmamegha Samadhi itself occurs nowhere else in the text. So provided as a translation of verses 28 through 30 by yours truly. So cessation of those is said to be like that of the afflictions. Further, for one who, owing to discriminative perception, has the highest degree of neutrality regarding meditation states, there is the Dharma cloud trance stage. From that, there is the destruction of afflicted results. Given that the phrase occurs nowhere else in the text, its inclusion here is noteworthy. As Klostermeyer points out, while the literal meaning of the words pose little challenge, the intended meaning proves more difficult to discern. He correctly notes that the only reference, quote, to Dharmamegha Samadhi in classical Hindu literature, outside the commentaries on the Yoga Sutra, is a reference in Vidyaranya's Panchadashi. In it, he mentions Dharmamegha Samadhi as the highest state to be reached in yoga, end quote. T.S. Rukmani, a noted scholar of Sanskrit, Samkhya, and Yoga, contextualizes this term in her article, Dharmamegha Samadhi in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, a critique, explaining that Dharmamegha Samadhi functions as the summation of the absorption process that Patanjali began describing in the first chapter of the text, the Samadhi Pada. In surveying the translations and commentaries of Chip Hartranft, Edwin Bryant, Jim Mallinson, and Mark Singleton, none of the translations and commentaries give sufficient attention to the Mahayana source material, where the phrase Dharmamegha Samadhi is a common occurrence. Hartranft's commentary contains a section entitled The Yoga Sutra in Light of Early Buddhism, in which no attempt is made to consider the phrase in context of the full breadth of Buddhist material available. In fact, by considering only so-called early Buddhism, Hartranft's commentary is weakened. Bryant focuses his commentary on summarizing the positions of classical Hindu commentators, and thus aligns his interpretation with those sources, excluding the possibility of interpreting the term through Buddhist lens. Similar to Bryant, Mallinson and Singleton limit their discussion to Hindu commentators, but acknowledge the influence of Buddhism on the Yoga Sutra, and in the ensuing chapters they also point to Buddhist source materials which bear relation to the text. Yet none of these interpreters have allowed this to factor into their interpretation, and thus their interpretation seems to bring us no closer to the way in which Patanjali is using the term. To understand his usage, we need to turn to the Mahayana Buddhist-marga literature, from which the term itself is derived. Marga, of course, means path, referring to the steps of spiritual and religious praxis. The path is laid out in great detail in Buddhist literature, receiving detailed examination in Mahayana texts and commentaries. The introduction to Robert E. Buswell Jr. and Robert M. Gamello's edited volume, Paths to Liberation, made clear that some form of teachings about the path of practice is common to all religions, and while yoga is not a religion, this would include the Yoga Sutra, as it provides, quote, patterns of religious behavior that have transformative power and will lead to specific religious goals, end quote. As the Yoga Sutra is an early contribution of the classical yoga tradition of path literature, we can look at the usage of Dharmamegha Samadhi in that text in the context of other path literature. We will now turn to two Buddhist texts, the Dashabhumika Sutra, or the Discourse on the 10 Stages, and Asanga's Bodhisattva-Bhumi, to analyze the phrase in other Marga literature. The Dashabhumika Sutra circulates both as an independent text and as a part of the Contendium Sutra, known as the Avatamsaka Sutra, or the Flower Ornament Discourse. In it, the path stages a bodhisattva is meant to traverse are delineated, along with the benefits to be acquired at each stage. In the Dashabhumika Sutra, Dharmamegha Samadhi is the final bhumi, or stage of the path. The Avatamsaka Sutra gives two explanations for the usage of megha. The passage explains that, like a cloud, bodhisattvas at this stage, quote, bear, receive, take in, and hold it all, end quote, which presumably refers to the perception that clouds receive and hold all the moisture that in due time will fall from them. The metaphor is then extended into the second usage, which is that bodhisattvas, quote, show great rains, extinguishing all the dust and flames of afflictions of great beings produced by ignorance, end quote. Thus, the metaphor of the cloud is used in reference to how bodhisattvas hold the Dharma or teaching and how they pour forth these teachings to extinguish the flames of affliction. It should be recalled that comparing afflictions to fire is common throughout Buddhist literature. In the Aditya Pariyaya Sutra, known in English as the Fire Sermon, of the Pali Canon, the Buddha is recorded as saying, quote, bhikkhus, all is burning. And what is the all that is burning? Burning with what? Burning with the fire of lust, with the fire of hate, with the fire of delusion. I say it is burning with birth, aging, and death, with sorrows, with lamentations, with pains, with griefs, with despairs. End quote. And in the Dharma-Pundarika Sutra, the Buddha is recorded as saying of this world, quote, "The multitude see it as consumed in fire, with anxiety, fear, and other sufferings filling everywhere." So for Buddhists, the world is on fire. That, I think, is clear. Thus, the Bodhisattvas pour forth the Dharma like a rain shower from a cloud to quench these flames which cause suffering and affliction. This is the extended metaphor, then, of the cloud. Patanjali will utilize this metaphor as an image for the active awakening described in the 4th chapter of his text. The Bodhisattva Bhumi, written by a Sangha who is thought to have lived in the 4th century, further develops the stages of the Bodhisattva's path. This is the Bodhisattva Bhumi's description of Dharmamegha Samadhi, translated by Artemis B. Engel with emendation by myself. So the Bodhisattva has completed the Bodhisattva path, and who has fully completed the accumulations that are necessary for enlightenment, receives from the Tathagatas an extremely vast shower of the true Dharma, one that resembles a massive cloud of Dharma and that cannot be borne by other sentient beings. That Bodhisattva resembles a great cloud, manifesting both forms that do not represent the enlightenment of a complete Buddha and forms that do represent the enlightenment of a complete Buddha, and causes the dust of immeasurable sentient beings as mental afflictions to be settled by an incomparably great rain of true Dharma. While established in this stage, he also causes manyfold roots of virtue to sprout, grow, and ripen. Therefore, this is called the Dharma cloud stage. Here, the metaphor of the cloud extends beyond what it leads the Bodhisattva to do for others, to what happens to the Bodhisattva him or herself. The Bodhisattva is showered with the Dharma as well. At this stage of the path, the Tathagata is the cloud and showers the Bodhisattva with the Dharma, leading to an alternate name for this stage, the Abhishek of Bhumi, or the consecration or coronation stage. On this stage, the Bodhisattva is anointed with the Dharma. This could be called the phenomenology of the cloud. And in the Bodhisattva Bhumi, a Sangha concentrates more upon describing the experiences of the stages, including Dharmamegha Samadhi, rather than solely focusing upon the actions of the Bodhisattva at each level. But for what reason does Patanjali rely on this Buddhist material? And how should we view his reliance? Patanjali relies upon the Samkhya twofold analysis, and I was scolded roundly for saying dualism in the writing phase of this paper by Dr. Chappell, yelling at me, "This is not a dualistic system." But indeed, regardless of that, right, Samkhya has a twofold analysis of reality, wherein there's Purusha, or pure witnessing, and Prakriti, or the primal material nature of reality. In the Samkhya system, manas, or mind, and buddhi, or intellect, are considered evolutes of Prakriti, and as such stand apart from pure witnessing. Therefore, any assertion of awakening or of progress through claims such as, "I have attained the goal," or "I am progressing on the path," are problematic. This is because such an assertion would still be in the realm of Prakriti. Thus, the yogi must remain disinterested in his or her experiences arising from meditation states along the path. Any notion of attainment and the possession of virtues, such as knowledge, should therefore be relinquished. In light of the Bhumi literature and the above statement on Samkhya, Patanjali is not saying that the yogi reaches the Dharma cloud stage as a result of disinterest in meditative wisdom arising from discriminative insight, i.e. the translation of Bryant, Hartranft, and Mallinson. Instead, Patanjali is saying that the Dharma cloud stage is obtained by the yogi's disinterest in the meditation states themselves. If the yogi were to reify any conception of having obtained discriminative discernment, they would be unable to reach the stage. And at the highest levels of the yogi's path, this interest in the fruits of practice is vital to completion. Looking at the usage of Dharmamegha Samadhi, in light of the above descriptions from the Dashabhumika Sutra and the Bodhisattva Bhumi, we can begin to discern what Patanjali may have had in mind when describing the end of the yogi's path. In the Mahayana literature that we have been considering, as the Bodhisattva progresses along the Bhumis and develops the accompanying perfections, obstructions and afflictions are eradicated. Additionally, the Bodhisattva is able to perceive one of the fundamental insights of Mahayana doctrine, namely shunyata, or emptiness. This leads to the perception of anutpatika dharma kshanti, or the non-production of the constituent elements of experience, like Neo in the Matrix earlier. These perceptions lead eventually to the 10th bhumi, the Bodhisattva's perfection of knowledge. This is analogous to Yoga Sutra 430, the destruction of the effects of afflicted action and thus of affliction itself. Following this description, Patanjali writes, quote, Then there is little left to be known, owing to the infinitude of knowledge which is free from all impure obstructions. Tada sarva avaranamala apetasya jnanyasya anantasya jnaya alpam. In other words, according to Patanjali's description, at this stage of the yogi's path, just as with the Bodhisattva, the knowledge acquired is everlasting, pure, and unobstructed. Klostermaier affirms that, quote, the use of the term Dharmamegha Samadhi in Yoga Sutra 429 does not appear to be arbitrary or purely technical in the sense that Patanjali could have chosen another term, as a quark could well be known by another name. The associations given to Dharmamegha in the Buddhist text seem to be of the essence of this samadhi. The cessation of klesha and karma is closely tied with the Dharmamegha, and the metaphor of the rain appears to be most appropriate since it extinguishes fire, washes away impurities, and provides a necessary condition for growth. End quote. It is impossible to determine the exact sources Patanjali drew upon in compiling his text. There are no footnotes, no endnote citations, no biblio, and so we don't know what exact sources Patanjali may have drawn from. Philip Moss argues that the sutras were compiled sometime between 325 and 425 Common Era. This is a little bit later than the 2nd century estimates that are normally touted. Moss's proposed dates overlap with the dates ascribed to Asanga and the Bodhisattva-bhumi. Additionally, the earliest translations of the Avatamsaka into Chinese were in the 5th century, thus making for a possible compilation date between the 2nd and 4th century. So it is possible that Patanjali was aware of the texts themselves, or at the very least was aware of the practices and ideas that they record. It should also be noted that Patanjali needn't have been confined to drawing upon Mahayana sources. Y. Krishnan writes in his 1984 article, The Origin and Development of the Bodhisattva Doctrine, that, quote, the doctrine of bhumis is not exclusively Mahayanist in character. Evidence of 10 bhumis is found in the Mahavastu of the Mahasangikas, end quote. In the same article, Krishnan notes that there was a parallel scheme of 14 stages of spiritual progress in Jainism. In the last or 14th stage, a Yoga Kevalam, he attains complete emancipation. So either way, it is clear that Patanjali's uses was intentional. Assertions related to describing progress along the path become difficult within the Samkhya system that underlines the Yoga Sutra. As stated earlier, a positive statement of attainment remains elusive. This is perhaps why Patanjali relies upon Buddhist sources to describe the end of the yogi's path. The Bodhisattva-bhumi literature offers a model of awakening that is not reliant on the reification of a self having the experience. So this is key for Patanjali. Thus, it is likely that Patanjali drew upon a variety of models in describing the yogic path, and that the stages outlined in Mahayana-marga literature, such as the Dashabhumika Sutra and the Bodhisattva-bhumi, provided a neat summary of the path. Finally, it is worth noting that Patanjali's conception of Dharmamegha Samadhi differs from Buddhist usage. Klostermaier explains, the Buddhist texts emphasize the altruistic aspects of this condition, the possibility for the Bodhisattva yoga to assist the world in reaching the highest goal, the beneficial effects of which the reign of Dharma has with regard to the quenching of the firebrand of the klesha of those still under their sway. The Yoga Sutra seems to be interested in the benefit of the Dharmamegha Samadhi for the sake of the yogin alone. His klesha and karma are eradicated. His knowledge is infinitely enlarged. His kaivalya is secured, which means the achievement of being his true self. In other words, some Buddhist texts emphasize the activity of the Bodhisattva at this stage of the path, whereas the Yoga Sutra is more concerned with the experience of this stage and its effects on the yogi. So in conclusion, in this paper I've examined the final stages of the yogi's path outlined in Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, known as Dharmamegha Samadhi, in light of the Mahayana Buddhist Marga literature where the term frequently occurs. Specifically, I focused on the Dashabhumika Sutra found in the Avatamsaka Sutra, and Asanga's Bodhisattva-marga. In both of these texts, Dharmamegha Samadhi is extensively described as a culmination of the Bodhisattva's path. Through this, I sought to once again take seriously the Buddhist influences that Klostermaier, Chappell, and others have pointed out. In particular, I argued that outside of the context of such literature, Patanjali's intention in using the term Dharmamegha Samadhi remains obscure, and as the term is a defining feature of the Bodhisattva path, outside of that literature, it doesn't make much sense. In contrast, it only rarely occurs in the context of Hindu literature and not at all in Jain literature, both of which were also significant influences on Patanjali's text. Furthermore, I demonstrated that when this literature is considered, it becomes possible to interpret what Patanjali may have been trying to say, specifically in regards to this kind of disinterest required at the final stages of the yogi's path. Finally, I acknowledge that it is difficult to determine exactly which sources Patanjali drew upon in compiling his text, as Mahayana literature is clearly not the only source he was drawing from. In the introduction to The Lovelorn Ghost and The Magical Monk, Buddhist scholar Justin McDaniel expressed the idea of a religious repertoire, building on notions of cultural repertoires. McDaniel explained that a repertoire includes the words, stock explanations, objects, and images that a social actor can draw upon while engaged in meaning-making on the ground in the context of interacting with others, end quote. He also notes that an advantage of analyzing in this way is the ability to cross sectarian boundaries. I will conclude this paper by briefly suggesting that we analyze the Yoga Sutra in the manner outlined by McDaniel, that we see Patanjali as drawing upon a religious and cultural repertoire that included, but was not limited to, Buddhist Marga literature, such as the Dashabhumika Sutra and the Bodhisattva-marga. Viewed in this way, we can begin to recover the sources that contributed to the development of the yoga tradition. Thank you.
I think the way we're going to do it is have the papers first, so hold on to questions, and we'll have time, I think at least 15 at the end for questions for all the papers. So, and thanks, Ralph, that was right on time. Thank you. So, our next presenter is Joseph.